Hey, y'all. So we are looking at the first lecture of the era, right? We're going to be looking at this. We're going to dissect this. I promise you that we won't be this long-winded over four paragraphs typically, but I wanted to break this down. This will help you understand some things about power mapping. But what we're looking at the P1 or the title, right? We're looking at the meaning and characteristics of the Italian Renaissance. So before I step out of these four paragraphs, I need to make sure I understand both the meaning and the characteristics of the Italian Renaissance. Okay, so we're going to look at that. We're going to, I think, the first part of our first one will be focused on meaning. So let's go and look at it. We're going to look at this definition of periodization and argumentation. These are two skills that you have to be able to have as a historian, and that's what we're training you to be as a historian. Periodization is creating the periods in which you're studying, and argumentation is creating an argument. And we're going to use this as that time period. So when we look at this during the Renaissance, I want to make sure people did not know they were living in a new era. We can think they maybe thought they were cool and hip, but in reality, most people's chief concern was survival. 97% of the people were either peasants or serfs, and if you've done your summer read, you know what those words mean. They're literally they're hoping to have enough food so that their family can survive. So this whole concept of Renaissance is kind of outside of their mindset. A few intellectuals wanted to define themselves as different from what they call the Dark Ages. We're going to see this more a little bit later. A guy named Petrarch is the one who defined what he thought was the Dark Ages. So these were the people who they thought they were kind of woke. They thought they were, ooh, we know everything, and we're going to see how that looks out. Overall, the concept of the Renaissance was created and defined by historians centuries later. So that's going to be one of those things that we're looking at. So let's jump into that. Why do historians define eras? Well, the reason we create periods or eras is that it defines the years we're being studied. Like the Renaissance. When I think of the Renaissance, I think of 1350, give or take a year, to 1603, death of Elizabeth. So we kind of look at that era. We're going to dissect that era. We're going to study that era as historians. We're going to see what's unique, what's a continuation, what is something different. It gives us context so we can kind of pursue kind of what is created, what are the patterns that are creating that. And it gives meaning to the time, like the Renaissance. When you say Renaissance, there are images that come up in my mind, and actually, the one behind you is one of my favorite paintings of the Renaissance, the School of Athens. So we'll talk more about that later. It allows for an argument to be formed. What is the Renaissance? And as I create an argument, you can argue against me, or I can argue against you, and we can say what if, and we can talk more about that. But those are why historians periodize. They create arguments, and that's really what the job of a historian is, to understand how the past fits in today. So the first historian that we really are ever going to talk about is Jacob Burckhardt. So look at your power maps right now or your outlines. I want to make sure you understand Jacob Burckhardt was not part of the Renaissance. He lived in 1860, which is about 260 years after the Renaissance came to an end. Jacob Burckhardt published his definitive work on the civilization of the Renaissance Italy in 1860, and he is really the modern historian that really defined the era. Something you may not totally understand, but I want to just give you some context. Burckhardt wrote this history as a response to the Romantics. He hated the Romantics. The Romantics were a group from the early 19th century, like 1800 to 1850, and they challenged the development of the modern era. They romanticized the Middle Ages. They theorized the Middle Ages was the greatest point of history, and it was really kind of a hot take, if you will. Many people were like, "What are you talking about?" They really kind of accused the Romantics of just being high on opium all the time. They challenged them, and really Jacob Burckhardt, who was probably stepping out of college by the end of the university at the end of this time, he really wanted to put his efforts on really making the Romantics look stupid. So he wrote this book, Civilization of the Renaissance of Italy, to define the Renaissance era, as a new era, distinct from that so-called backwards Middle Ages. He really hated the Middle Ages. He hated Christendom. He hated the papacy. I'm not sure if he hated the Catholic Church, but he hated that just traditional mindset. And he wanted to argue that the Middle Ages lacked civilization of both antiquity and the modern era. So to prove the Renaissance was unique, Burckhardt argued that the Renaissance was a drastic break from the Middle Ages. The individualism and secularism of the age eradicated or stripped away Christendom, weakening the papacy, which is not 100% wrong. He just over exaggerates. We'll see that in a second. He argued that the middle class and the intellectuals created a new urban society that directly connected them to the 19th century's urbanization. So, what he's looking at doing, he's attempting to sculpt the history to justify what has happened in the moment. And I won't lie to you, many historians do that, and that's what I like to do. I like to dissect and tear down other historical arguments, and I want to look at the documents. Because if all we do is listen to Jacob Burckhardt, we think the Renaissance is this wonderful moment of everything was cool and everything was hunky dory. Well, that's not necessarily true. We're going to see how that plays out. But that's what Burckhardt did. He created an argument about the period of the Renaissance. In his periodization of the Renaissance, Burckhardt over exaggerated the individuals in secularism. We're going to see that a majority of the art of the age is religious art. So therefore, it's not necessarily secularism completely. 100% of the population still were identified as Christians. There were no atheists. The number of Jews that were within society were ostracized because, again, the majority of people were Christians. So we see kind of, how is that true? He does ignore the medieval scientific, economic, and political patterns that continued during the Renaissance. He wanted to break away and say this is a distinct era. And again, usually that's where it kind of gets dangerous. And he created an argument that is still being evaluated today. We as historians still are trying to figure that out. And if you go to college to study history and you really love the Renaissance, you want to create your own argument for the Renaissance, it's a wonderful era to study. But with that said, we're going to move on. So what are the characteristics of the Renaissance? So we just identified the meaning. The meaning of the Renaissance, something I didn't say. The actual meaning is the rebirth of Europe. The rebirth of Europe, the birth of the modern era. That's what the actual meaning is, but that's another story. All right, so what are the characteristics of the Renaissance? So we see the rise of urban society. And we see this after the 12th century, a revival of urban areas, cities began. And really, that's kind of some of the context of the Black Death that you read about. They're different from the rural areas. Urban areas were densely populated and with a diverse culture. I love this image. This is a medieval painting, or excuse me, an early Renaissance painting of Florence. And you just look at that urban area there. You know, it's so densely populated. And there's going to be a diverse culture. If you lived in Florence in the 12th and 13th century, you would have access to Chinese silk. You would have African culture within there. You have some Turkish culture. So you just have this kind of a culture diffusion because merchants were going back and forth. And we'll talk more about this tomorrow. Instead of the nobility, which you read about in the previous readings, the nobility, the lords overlording the serfs, and really in the rural areas, merchants began to really dominate the age. Italian city-states such as Florence and Venice became the focal point of the new Renaissance era. And really, when I think of it, this is really the era, right? This is the center of the Renaissance from approximately 1350 to 1494. And we'll see that why that year is important a little bit later. But it's about Venice, it's about Milan, it's about Florence, it's about the Papal States, not so much about Naples. So it's an urban area. The Renaissance was also an age of the recovery. Sometimes we call this Quattrocento, the Italian word for the 14th century. And really the second part of the 14th century is where we see that recovery from a devastating weather pattern. Let's just say weather patterns, peasant rebellions, and the Black Plague. We see here a painting that you may have seen from your textbook. It's by Tiernini, and it's just the recovery, which is such a wonderful piece. You kind of see these are the noble people who have survived the plague, and here's the dead people that are leaving behind. They're mourning, but they're about to go off and party. A new sense of stability had been gotten during the 14th and 15th centuries. So this, what happens is this chaos, this destruction, we begin to see it stabilize. Intellectuals were able to ponder and research. And really, this is the time that they discovered ancient manuscripts of the Greco-Roman era. We'll talk much more about this later, but these are documents that predate the Middle Ages, predate the church establishment. They began to question the absolutes of Christendom. This is what we call humanism. This develops a new set of values called humanism here. Let me see, humanism. And there's a whole, the rest of the chapter will be about humanism. We see that the Renaissance is about individualism and secularism. We see intellectuals began to challenge the church teachings, to begin to think what is truth independently of the papacy. Rather than one needing a savior for this world, humans can find their worldly salvation in themselves. They were responsible for the creation of this age, not a distant God. A key quote, and this is one quote I hope you memorize. Alberti, who is one of the key humanists, he said, "Men can do all things if they will." This is a powerful argument, a statement against a scripture in Philippians. There's in the book of Philippians, something that Christians hold true. They say, "A man can do all things. Christ will do all things through us." And it's the idea that Christians believe that Christ is the reason we're successful. Here, Alberti saying, "Man can do all things if he will." This is really vacant of God, and though I know Burkhardt exaggerated, I do want to point out this is where we begin to see this concept of individualism. Really, the goal of the individual is to become the universal person, also known as the Uomo Universale, which I'm not Italian. And this is a drawing from Leonardo da Vinci. It's just really kind of the idea of the focus of the individual. The Renaissance was also an upper class movement. Really, it's about 2%. It impacted only about 2% of the population. Europeans that participated in this, again, this is what you might say bougie, the people who accumulated the wealth. Here's kind of a Gonzaga family. This is kind of an illustration of what we might say a bougie family, a bourgeois family might be. The merchants utilized the new wealth to fund cultural movements. The merchants sought to secularize society in hopes of reducing the power of the papacy over their everyday lives. And I promise you, that's going to be really important. The Medici family is going to be the one that we really see, and they're going to fund most of the Florentine Renaissance, as well as much of the French Renaissance. So when we look at this, we've seen what we've done. We've given meaning. The Renaissance is the rebirth of modern Europe. We see the birth of modern Europe. We see the rebirth of antiquity. We see Jacob Burckhardt had created a meaning for this era. He, despite what we think or not think, we know that the Renaissance was an era that dates from 1350 to about 1600. We know it began in Italy. And we also know it's an era that revived on the study of antiquity, created a new focus on the individual, occurred primarily in the urban areas, centers of Italy, and was supported by the wealthy classes. And really, that's what it is in a nutshell. We are really hypersensitive on the first 4 paragraphs here. I just want to make sure you understand those are the kind of things that I need you to get out when you're power mapping. But I'm here to help you guys out. So I hope that makes sense.